In a lot of my bike videos, I throw out terminology that may be unfamiliar to those of you who are newer to the sport. So this video, I'm going to title A Beginner's Guide to Bike Component Terminology. The target audience is going to be those who are newer to the sport of cycling, or you just may have not had someone tell you all the names of components and parts of a bicycle along your way. So let's get started. For this video, I'm going to be using my Giant Anthem cross-country mountain bike, and I may refer to my cyclocross bike for some of the component names. So this will be unscripted. I'm just going to go through the bike, and I'm going to start with the bike frame names because this is important. On the bike frame, the tube going across the top is referred to as the top tube. The one that goes slanted from the handlebar area down to this area is called the down tube. The tubes that go from your rear axle up this way are called seat stays. The ones that go along the bottom down here are called chain stays. This tube that runs up from this, this is a seat post, down to this area, this is called your seat tube. Also, on a suspension mountain bike, you're going to have what's called linkages. And these are components that move that allow the suspension to cycle through its travel. So this one has an upper link and also down here a lower link. The part of the frame down here that holds the bearings, and we'll get into the cranks and everything in a minute, but this is called the bottom bracket shell. It's kind of a round area, again, where bearings are housed. Up here at the top, this part of the frame is called the head tube. And again, you've got bearings in there that I'll talk about in a minute. This component that holds the front wheel is referred to as a fork. Now obviously this is a mountain bike with suspension, so typically this is referred to as a front suspension fork, a fork, or a front shock. On the rear shock, this is typically referred to, a lot of people just call this the shock and this the fork of a mountain bike, but this could be known as a shock or a rear shock. And while I'm talking about suspension on a mountain bike, when someone says travel, what they're referring to is the amount of movement a shock has. So a cross-country bike is going to have less travel, usually about 80 to 100 millimeters, and a more gravity-oriented bike or a trail bike is going to have longer travel, 120, 150 or higher. So again, travel refers to how much the suspension can move. So I mentioned the bottom bracket shell of the frame. Inside the bottom bracket shell is the bottom bracket. And that is the component that allows the cranks to move. So there is a spindle that goes all the way through the bottom bracket shell that the crank arms will attach onto. So this is referred to as a crank arm. This chain ring, this is called a chain ring. This has teeth on it. And when you buy a chain ring, you're going to need to pay attention to the number of teeth on the chain ring. So the bigger the chain ring, the bigger the gear, or the faster you can go. This chain ring is referred to as a narrow wide. What that means is one tooth is wide and one tooth is narrow. Wide, narrow. What this does is it holds the chain on so that you don't need a front derailleur or what's called a chain guide, which just kind of goes around the chain, which I'll show on my cyclocross bike. So the narrow wide chain rings will lock a chain on so you don't need something to hold it on. It's a newer type component that's really revolutionizing the mountain bike industry. The bolts here that hold the chain ring are simply referred to as chain ring bolts. So this is a chain guide, and this is on my cyclocross bike. And even though this does also have a narrow wide chain ring, Giant included this to just have extra security of making sure the chain stays on. This is a race bike, so you really want to make sure that chain doesn't come off and ruin your race. So this, again, is a chain guide, and the reason you have this is because you don't have a front derailleur. I will go back up here to the handlebar area, and let's go over the components up here. So this is referred to as a stem. Now when you buy a stem, it will come in different types of length and different types of rise. So the higher the rise, the more it's going to angle up. Generally, a stem is going to have between 7 and 10 degrees of rise. Now the nice thing about that is you could flip the stem over and have what's called a negative rise. So in other words, the stem, instead of coming up, is either going to be flat or it may even come down a little bit, and that you can do to lower the handlebars. So this is the stem bolts. This component right here that kind of pushes the stem on is referred to as a top cap. Most bikes now will have these. Older bikes had what was called a quill stem, where it kind of had a wedge down in here and you tighten the wedge. But most stems now today will have a top cap. The bearings inside the head tube of the frame are referred to as headset bearings, and they allow your handlebars to move back and forth. And you're going to have what's called spacers here, and that's just so that you can raise your stem up or down, because the length of the steerer tube, and a steerer tube is the part of the fork that is inside the frame that the bearings go around and that the stem locks onto. The steerer tube length is fixed. You cannot change it. So the only way to raise or lower your stem is to move these spacers either above the stem to lower the stem, or move the spacers below the stem to raise the stem up. Now this is obviously referred to as the handlebar, and when you buy a mountain bike handlebar, you're going to want to pay attention to the back sweep and the rise and also the width. So this handlebar actually has all of those on it. So this is at 8-degree back sweep, 4-degree up sweep, 20mm rise, and 25mm width. So the width is obviously how wide the handlebar is. The back sweep refers to how the handlebar angles back towards you. This is, like I said, an 8-degree, which is pretty good for cross-country use. And then the rise is simply going to refer to how far up the grips are. So a total flat bar is going to have a 0-degree rise, so the grips may be down here. A bar with like a 40mm rise is going to allow the grips to come up here. So for cross-country type use, I think a 20mm rise is good. Even ones that are flat bars may have a slight rise, so maybe like a 5-degree rise. At the end of the handlebar, you've got grips. Usually on a mountain bike, they're either foam or rubber. The ones that have metal on the ends, that have Allen screws that hold the grip onto the bike, are referred to lock-on grips. You can actually tighten those on. The nice thing about lock-on grips is to get them off, all you have to do is loosen the Allen bolt and the grips slide off. With pure rubber grips or pure foam grips that don't have locking collars, then you would have to kind of work them off. I use an air compressor and blast air underneath, and that will allow the grips to come off easily, and I actually have a video that shows how to do that. Also up here at the handlebar area, you've got your brakes. And I'm not going to go into every little component of a brake, but this is simply referred to as your brake lever. This is referred to as the reservoir. This is a hydraulic brake, which means it has some fluid inside to make the brakes work, as opposed to a cable actuated brake. Most mountain bikes today are going hydraulic, whereas a lot of road and cyclocross bikes have cables inside. So this is a hydraulic brake, and this is the reservoir that holds the fluid. In a brake, most brakes are going to have mineral oil like the Shimano's, or an actual DOT fluid. I like the mineral oil because it doesn't corrode if it gets on paint and things like that. It's not as toxic to handle as opposed to DOT fluid. So if you have a brake with DOT fluid, just be careful and really don't touch it with your fingers. Also up here you've got your shifters. So this is the rear shifter. So most of the time on a bicycle, the rear brake and the rear shifter is going to be on the right side. And then over here you've got your left shifter. Now you'll notice this bike does not have left brake. This bike does not have a left shifter because this is a single chainring bike with no front derailleur. And the derailleur would be the component here that causes the chain to move back and forth between the chain rings. So while I'm mentioning derailleurs, let's jump back here to the back, and this is called your rear derailleur. Some people call this a rear changer. In America, it's typically referred to as a rear derailleur. So this allows the chain to move back and forth as you shift the shifter, the right shifter. These teeth back here are called, typically this is referred to as a rear cassette or a rear cog. This may also be referred to as gears in the back. But on the rear cassette, you've got smaller teeth down here at the bottom, and the smaller the teeth in the back, the faster you're going to pedal or what's referred to as the higher gear, which is the opposite of the front. So in the front, the smaller the teeth, the lower the gear, and the slower you would be riding. So in the back, typically it's going to be around an 11 or 12, going all the way up to maybe a 36 or a 38, or now some of the 11-speed ones that are really made for single front chain rings and go all the way up to like a 42. So you've got a really low climbing gear when you've got a big cog in the back. And I do want to mention that on rear derailleurs today, you typically will have a really firm spring now because of the fact that a lot of bikes are coming with just single front chain rings. So this, Shimano calls it the Shadow Plus. So what that means is when you deactivate this lever, the spring, the tension on the derailleur cage, and this is referred to as a derailleur cage, can move more freely so you can get the rear wheel off. Typically when you're riding, you're going to want this lever on, and that really firms up the spring and limits what's called chain slap. Chain slap is when the chain kind of hits your chain stay. Remember, this is called a chain stay. And so the tighter the tension is on this rear derailleur cage, the less chain slap you're going to have. And really the chain slap that this prevents is the one down here. Typically when you're cranking hard, this chain is firm. But you're going to see a lot of chain stay protectors on bikes, and that is to protect the chain stay from slap, either from the top or the chain down below. And you'll see this is my homemade chain stay protector, which I mentioned in another video. A lot of these will come on a bike already, and companies like Lizard Skin will make a neoprene chain stay protector. So I really like having these on a lot of my bikes because I don't want the chain to slap the chain stay. One more thing I do want to mention on the rear derailleur is you've got these wheels, which are called pulley wheels or jockey wheels, and they allow the chain to move freely through the rear derailleur. Now let's talk about the components of a wheel, and I'll start with the hub. And the hub is this component here that has the bearings inside, and the bearings allow the wheel to obviously spin, and it's the same for the rear and the front. The difference with the rear is it's got what's called a free hub. The free hub is the mechanism that allows the bike to, allows you to pedal, and it will move the tire, and then when you stop pedaling, the pedals cannot move and the rear wheel keeps spinning. So that is a one-way mechanism that's again referred to as a free hub. Inside the free hub you've got pawls, and those are the things that grab when you pedal. Now this bike has what's referred to as a through axle, and this is what you're starting to see on more and more mountain bikes and even cyclocross bikes, and I believe you're going to start to see it on road bikes. So road bikes and older mountain bikes today have what's called basically a quick release. So all you would do to get the rear wheel or front wheel off is undo the quick release, kind of spin it a couple times to just kind of spread it out a little bit, and the wheel will fall out. On a through axle, the only way to get a wheel out is to undo the axle, thread it all the way out, pull it out, and then you can get the rear wheel or front wheel off. Now a through axle is going to be spaced wider, and that's going to allow the bike to be stiffer. So this is a 142 by 12. So the 142 refers to how long the axle is. The 12 refers to how thick the axle is. And now they're starting to go even wider and thicker. So the Boost 148 is an even wider axle, and that means back here the frame's got to be wider to compensate it. And I didn't mention this before when I talked about the frame, but this kind of area of the frame is referred to as a drop out, and you've got the same thing on a fork, and this is again referred to as a drop out, and that was because of the older quick release. When you undid the quick release, the wheel would just drop out. Now with the through axle, they don't really drop out until you actually pull the axle all the way out. Now while I'm talking about the axles, let me talk about the front, because again this is a through axle, and on the front this is a Fox, and typically Fox calls it a 15 QR. So 15 refers to how big or how fat this axle is. So the fatter the axle, the stiffer the front's going to be, and the better the bike's going to ride. So let's finish up with the components of a wheel, and this is obviously referred to as the tire, and these little things here are called knobs. So a mountain bike tire is going to have knobs. Cyclocross tires will have little knobs, and road bike tires will have no knobs at all. This is referred to as the rim. So that's the part that the tire goes into. Now, a lot of people, when they refer to a wheel, so you might hear someone say, hey, I got a new set of wheels. What they're talking about really is everything except for the tire and the rear cassette. So it's going to just have the hubs and the spokes and the rims. Now, you might hear someone in a race say, hey, I need a wheel. And what they mean is they need the whole thing. They need you to hand them a wheel that's going to be able to go right on their bike with a tire and get them going again. Now, I have this bike set up as tubeless, and what that means is that there is no tube inside this tire. It's just air, and the only way that you can really do that is you put a fluid in there, and a lot of times people refer that as Stan's fluid or Stan's solution, and that will seal up any tiny holes, any tiny pores, so that the tire can be run without a tube. And you're going to see that more and more on mountain bikes, and even on my cyclocross bike, I run it without tubes. The way that you do that is you've got to have a rim that's designed to run a tire as tubeless. And inside the rim, you've got a little channel that the tire will seat into and not allow the air to get out. Now, older rims can be converted to tubeless by a rubber rim strip. You can even make those as a DIY, do-it-yourself kind of thing, but you can buy a rubber rim strip that goes inside an older rim that will allow the tire to go in. The rims that are designed to run tubeless are obviously a lot easier to do that. And I'll mention one last thing about wheels. This is a carbon rim, and carbon rims are more expensive. They require a lot more time and material to make compared to an aluminum rim. The advantage of a carbon rim is that it is stiffer. In other words, the wheel cannot flex as much going back and forth, and that allows the bike to handle better. It's a more precise handling bike, and it doesn't get thrown off the line when you go over rougher terrain. And I find carbon more important on a mountain bike than a cyclocross bike or a road bike. I had mentioned the brake levers up on the handlebars. The component that actually works a hydraulic brake is referred to as a caliper. So this is a brake caliper, and inside you've got brake pads, and those are the pads that actually touch what's called the rotor, and the rotor is going to bolt onto the hub. And a rotor will bolt onto the hub usually with 6 bolts. Shimano makes one that's called a center lock, which is just one big component that tightens down on the hub and that holds the rotor on. But again, I think most of the time you're going to see what's called a 6-bolt configuration that holds the rotor onto the hub. The part of the frame where the rear brake and the front brake goes onto is called a post, or a brake post, and that allows these bolts to hold the brake on. And if you were to loosen these bolts, the brake could kind of pivot back and forth a little bit, and that's because you actually have to center the brake pads over the rotor so that you don't get any rub. This is your brake cable. Again, this is hydraulic, so you've got hydraulic fluid coming through here. This little bolt here is called the banjo bolt. So you could loosen this a little bit, pivot this banjo bolt, this fitting here, so that it angles right, so that you don't have a sharp angle on here. And again, the banjo bolt allows that movement. A few other things that I want to mention. This is referred to as a saddle or a seat, and these rails are referred to as saddle rails. And this is your seat post. And so obviously the seat post holds the saddle on by the saddle rails. This is called a seat post collar, and this is what you would tighten down to lock the seat post down, or loosen it to slide the seat post up and down. And by the way, let me mention that a lot of times on components you're going to see what's called a torque spec, and that's important because you don't want to over tighten a component. You can either crack a carbon seat post or carbon handlebar, or you might do damage to the frame if you try to over tighten. So I recommend getting a torque wrench that helps you know exactly how much to tighten components like a seat post collar especially, and also stem bolts. This is obviously referred to as a pedal, and these are clipless pedals. Back in the day, pedals had these big clips that went over your shoe, and this is mainly for road, not really for mountain. although you did see a little bit of those in mountain biking. But these are referred to as clipless because it does not have that toe clip to hold your shoe onto the pedal. And you would get a special shoe and a special cleat. The cleat goes onto the shoe and then locks into the pedals. And the way that you get your foot out of the clipless pedals is you move your heel sideways and it pops out. Now also, you're going to hear the terminology flat pedals or platform pedals. Those are the ones that are much bigger and designed to be ridden with just a standard shoe. A few things that I'll mention on my cyclocross bike, and cyclocross bikes are very similar to road bikes. They just have a little bit slacker geometry. And when someone says geometry on a bike, what they're really talking about is the angle. So like the fork angle, that's referred to as the head tube angle. And the slacker the angle, the more the fork's going to come out, and the more the bike is going to be, it's going to be stable, but it's also not going to turn as quick. So a bike that's designed to be faster and quicker is going to have what's called steeper angles. So on the cyclocross bike, obviously the handlebars are different. These are referred to typically as drop bars. So they've got this kind of bend in the bar, so it's got several positions to put your hands. So you could hold here, you could hold on here. This is called the hoods. So this part of a road or cyclocross shifter and brake that comes up is called the brake hood. So you can hold onto it, or on a drop bar you could also hold down here to get more aerodynamic. So this bike obviously also has a rear derailleur, but this bike has electronic shifting, so there is no cable that comes inside. So the cable, whether it's electronic or cable actuated, is going to be called basically a derailleur cable. So this cable is basically just a wire that plugs into the rear derailleur. So this is what's really called Shimano Di2. That's Shimano's electronic shifting, and SRAM also makes electronic shifting. And the way that works is you've just got a button here that you would press and the derailleur shifts. So you wouldn't have to move a cable actuated lever to shift. So that will wrap it up for this video. If you found it helpful for you, please leave it a thumbs up. And if you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Thanks for watching.